Here at Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give the majority of the talks. We have a planning meeting every quarter, and it's open to the whole community, which means you, if you're here, you're a member of our community. And we consider suggestions for talks that we would like to give and that we'd like to hear. If you have ideas for guest speakers, also please send them to board@seattleatheist.church, and we'll follow up with those. But today, join me in welcoming Eva and giving her talk on how to change your mind and not die. Unmute yourself for a moment and let's give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you. So yes, today's talk is how to change your mind and not die. Little over dramatic maybe, but that's kind of what our back brains end up thinking about change sometimes. So I've got kind of a bunch of perspectives on this. I'm going to go through the fear of ego death, the illusion of a self, growth mentality, process philosophy, and my own experience. Kind of a quick crash course in some of this stuff. There are lots of other things I could cover about personal change. My last talk was on Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg, kind of links into how you can make changes. There are technologies and approaches like Kaizen and neuro-linguistic programming that you can use to make changes. But this is about one particular barrier to change, which is a big one for most people, which is that change itself can feel really threatening or impossible, but impossible and threatening. So lots of times we want to make changes to our habits or our attitudes or our behaviors or emotional landscape, but we get in our own way when it comes to actually making those changes. So one big reason for that is that we construct our idea of ourself from all of our memories, our actions, our thoughts, our beliefs, and we say, this is who I am. I might be a Democrat, a flute player, an Australian, a costumer, a mother of four, somebody who really cares about the environment. We might think of all these things as being us, like this is who I am. And we also carve out a space for what we're not. Oh, I'm not a morning person. I'm not a racist. I'm not a math person. I'm not an artist. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not somebody who could just up and fly to New York on no notice. And these ideas of ourselves shape not only our thoughts, but they shape our lives. They can be helpful. They can help us make behavior choices that are in line with our values. They can help us find other people like us to associate with, but they can also really get in our way. They can get us stuck in an identity that isn't working for us, and they can keep us from making necessary changes. An identity is like a pot for yourself with your name on it. And sometimes we need to be repotted so we can grow. We don't just get root bound in that one little pot with that one little label. For instance, let's say you've got somebody who wants to quit drinking because he knows it's damaging his health. He knows it's damaging his relationships, but he finds himself thinking, well, I'm a guy who likes to have a beer after work. I'm someone who hangs out with his friends at the bar. That's just who I am. Now, it's not useful to talk about whether that is true. I mean, sure, you can say, yes, obviously he does like to have a beer after work. Obviously, he does like to go to the bar with his friends. But talking about whether that's true is not to the point. It's not useful. It's true now, he does those things, but it doesn't have to be who he is forever. And if we talk about it as his identity, saying this is who he is, that is going to make it more psychologically difficult for him to make changes. So there are better ways to talk about things that you do than talking about them as being your nature, if you want to be changing those things. When we identify ourselves as a particular kind of person, it can not only seem hard to change that, it can seem actually threatening. So if I think I'm a runner, that's who I am, then if I stop running, I died. I'm gone. The runner has ended. It's dangerous to think of yourself as something that you do. Because if you can't do that thing anymore, or you need to stop doing that thing, suddenly you lose your sense of self. It's not just big things like being somebody's spouse or your lifelong career, where changing it, obviously there's a loss there. But it could be anything you identify with, a band you listen to, or a store you shop at, or a time you go to bed. For some people, changing those things can feel threatening to their sense of self. And if we think of anything as being an intrinsic part of ourselves, then part of our brains is going to fight changing that. It's going to see that as an existential threat. I can't change that. That's who I am. I'll die. There really is part of your brain that goes, no, I'll die when you try to make a change. And it's pretty hard to make a change when part of your brain is telling you it'll be fatal. And of course, there are some beliefs that have built-in hooks in them. If you have a belief that as part of the belief system has, if you don't believe this, you'll die or you'll suffer forever in hell. If you have a belief that has that hook in it, it's got its own little extra built in, you're going to die if you change thing. That's a whole separate problem, but it is related to this. So sometimes if you're trying to change a belief or a perspective, it can be helpful to notice, hey, that belief is only scary from inside the belief. If I didn't believe this, it wouldn't scare me. I wouldn't be scared that I would go to hell for not believing it because I wouldn't believe that part either. So sometimes you need to experiment with what it would be like to not believe something and tell yourself you can always go back if it's too dangerous. But on to other pieces of this problem. There was one illustration of this. We just were watching the new season of Letterkenny last night. Kind of an amazing show, combination of brilliant and incredibly asinine humor. So season 10, episode 7, there are several men who are nervous about getting prostate exams. And they're talking about why. And one of them says, well, I fear change. Someone else says, well, that sounds like a slow death. And that's kind of the core here, because if you don't change, you are going to die. I mean, we're all going to die. But if you don't change, you're going to die slowly and pointlessly because you can't adapt and you're not going to learn anything. So somehow we have to get ourselves to the point where we are willing to change and learn and adapt to be able to do the things we actually want to do rather than be trapped in old versions of ourselves. So first of all, how do we get around this stuff? We need to think of ourselves in a different way. We need to think of ourselves in a more flexible, process-focused, and growth-oriented way. The idea of a consistent, unchanging self is not only not useful and often actively harmful, it's also simply not true. It is provably not true. So let's start there, the illusion of consistent self. Let's start with actual physical continuity. There's the philosophical example of the ship of Theseus, where Theseus has this ship and it's made of all these boards and parts. And gradually over time, parts of it wear out and get replaced. You take off a board here and there. You need to shave down this part, take off this part, put on a new one. And eventually, if this ship sticks around long enough, it's not going to have any of its original parts, never mind the details of ship construction. Assume that all the parts can be replaced. If you've replaced all the parts, is it still the same ship? You can argue this, but obviously it is not the same parts it was before. And you know what? You aren't either, because all of your cells are being continually replaced over time. Some of them get replaced more slowly than others, but you are definitely not the same cells or the same atoms that you started off as. So you cannot logically and consistently identify with your matter. You are not the same matter you started as. So we can start there, but also we are, the self as a concept is an illusion, as both Buddhists and neuroscientists will tell you. There's not some entity separate from all of our physical existence and the changes it goes through that is us. There's not some separate thing. It's just the sum of it all the patterns. We are the sum of our parts and our actions the patterns made up of all our neurons and all our other cells and everything they do and experience for our whole lives. And even the division between ourselves and the rest of the world is something of an illusion. We respond to things, things change us. What we eat and drink and breathe and look at all changes us. The bacteria in our guts make decisions for us about what we're going to eat and what we're going to do next. And they outnumber the cells that are us. So where those boundaries are is very fuzzy. It's not a good idea to try to identify with some specifically delineated set of physical things. Onward, besides the physical thing being a silly thing to identify with, we start out with a certain body and temperament, and that's based on our genetics and our early environment. We learn our first opinions and habits from our families and then from our peers. Obviously, we change over time, physically and mentally. We still think of ourselves as being fundamentally the same person we were as a child. Even if we've been through some big changes, we're still the same person. And we think of ourselves as the same person as who we'll be in 10 or 20 years, even though we know we've grown, we'll age, we'll learn things, we've changed our perspectives, we'll keep doing that. But if we allow those changes to our bodies and minds, we have to concede that other changes are possible too. Purposeful changes are possible too. We undergo lots of changes by chance, based on our experiences and who we associate with. We might make friends with a horror movie fan or with an anarchist, and our interests and our perspectives end up shifting a little closer to them because we care about them, talk about things with them a lot. We might happen to have a teacher or a supervisor who has some particular school of thought. And maybe that means we don't get as much exposure to other schools of thought. We end up absorbing some of those ideas and missing alternatives. But we don't have to be limited to what we're born into or happen to encounter. We can also make conscious, intentional choices about what kind of person to be, what to believe, what to practice, what to do, what to learn about. And this gets into growth mindset. Carol Dweck came up with the term growth mindset. She was studying students at Stanford, and she found that students who were more successful had a different mindset from the ones who were less successful. The ones who were more successful had the growth mindset based on the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your efforts. People may differ every which way in their initial talents and aptitudes, interests, or temperaments, but everyone can change and grow through application and experience. In contrast, the students who were less successful had a fixed mindset. You're born with talent or not. There's no point in trying to get better at something that you're not already good at. And fixed mindset leaves us continually anxiously trying to prove we're good at things we think of ourselves as good at, but not trying to improve or expand our skills. It's something that gifted kids can sometimes get stuck in. If they've been told they're really smart early on and they're really good at things that didn't take effort, they can get into trouble when they start getting into higher levels of classes where suddenly it starts to take effort and they start getting scared that they're not smart, but they still have to prove that they're smart. They have to learn how to learn, and some do and some don't. But if you get stuck in that, I'm smart, so I should be good at this, you're not going to do as well as if you're, okay, I am the kind of person who learns things. I'm going to learn this. I can work hard and I can get better at this. Whether you have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset, it is self-fulfilling. If you believe you can't change, you will stagnate, you'll feel stuck, you'll find it hard to learn or adapt. If you believe you can change, you'll find it much easier to learn new information, skills, and perspectives to adapt to changing circumstances and new understanding of the world. To learn, you have to be willing to be wrong, to realize you're wrong, to fail, to see the difference between where you are and where you want to be next. You picture a martial arts student arriving in class on the first day. If that student arrives thinking, I am a really good martial artist, I already know everything, they are not going to learn a thing. They're going to be busy showing off and proclaiming their expertise, not watching or listening to the teacher. And they will actually be a dangerous person to practice with because they're not going to be able to learn from the feedback of the teacher or what their classmates are doing either. On the other hand, a martial artist who shows up in class at any level of expertise, from rank beginner to ninth dan black belt, if they show up knowing they have more to learn, because everybody does, they will be able to watch for differences between what they're doing and what the teacher is doing. They'll be able to work to improve their speed, their power, their precision, their response to attacks, and they will be willing to practice until their responses take no thought and very little effort and keep building on their knowledge. A person who is willing to learn can even learn from people who are less expert than them, but you have to be able to pay attention in the right ways. And another piece of this is the self. Well, it's easy to think of objects as static and people as static objects. There's a long Western tradition from back with Aristotle and Socrates of thinking primarily about matter and about the properties of individual types of matter. Things are unchanging, they have distinct features, they belong to certain sets, they are better or worse examples or approach the ideal more closely or less closely. And the process is kind of something that happens to or by the object, but it's kind of secondary. But when you have an image of a thing in time or a person in time, that image is just one moment. That's one fragment of the whole. And if we think of ourselves as a process occurring through time, that is both more accurate and more useful. There's no such thing as perfection or arrival. There's just the process of changing and growing and traveling the path of our lives. Not every ancient Western philosopher was stuck on unchanging matter. Heraclitus said you can't step in the same river twice. And that's because the water has moved on by the time you step in it again. In fact, by the time you have your second foot down, you're already in completely different water. You can't even step in the same river once. So if we insist on defining a river by the water contained in it, we're always going to be wrong. We're going to be way behind the times. We can't keep up with the river if we're defining it by the water. But if we define it by its continuity as a process, we can step in that river as many times as we like. We just need not to be stuck on the idea of it being the same water. Quite a bit later than Heraclitus, obviously, the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who also worked with Bertrand Russell on, I think it was mathematical logic, founded some important stuff there, but he also founded the school of process philosophy. And process philosophy, instead of taking matter and substance as primary and breaking the universe down into elemental particles, it takes process as primary. And it says that processes are best understood by their relationships with other processes. So rather than talking about there's this thing over here and then it does this, we say this thing happens. There is this process that happens and it reacts with other processes in these ways. Whitehead says there is urgency in coming to see the world as a web of interrelated processes of which we are integral parts, so that all of our choices and actions have consequences for the world around us. So each of us is a process, as well as a collection of processes, as well as an element of larger processes. So we kind of see these things as nested and interwoven at the same time. So far I've talked about the fear of ego death and the illusion of self and growth mentality and process philosophy. And I'd like to kind of tie this together with some personal experience of mine. Quite a few years ago, like 10 years ago or so, I had a scary experience. My family told me they needed me to be gentler and kinder. They said that sometimes I talked to them in ways that were sarcastic, critical, passive aggressive, and it really hurt them and alienated them. And Mickey told me that if that didn't change, she couldn't see how our marriage would last. This wasn't a threat. This was like, this piece of this isn't working and it's going to pull us apart. I can't see how it's going to work if that doesn't change. That was terrifying. But it wasn't just terrifying, it was baffling. Because I wasn't even aware of saying anything wrong or mean. I thought of the way I spoke as normal, neutral, perfectly fine, the way everybody does it. So being told I was doing it wrong was scary and confusing. It made me angry. It wasn't fair. I couldn't see how I had any hope of changing something I couldn't even see I was doing, didn't even fundamentally believe I was doing. I didn't think I should have to change something that was a perfectly acceptable way to behave according to mainstream culture. My family was obviously just being weirdly hypersensitive and having unreasonable expectations. This is just the way I am. I just talk like this. But my family was telling me it hurt them. And I believed they were responding to something real. So despite having no idea how to do it, I committed to change. I committed to shifting my communication to be clearer and more gentle and more positive. I even thought those were contradictory. I thought you couldn't be clear and gentle at the same time. I figured it out eventually. I read books and websites. I did exercises. I took notes. I gave compliments and reassurances. I asked for do-overs when I realized I'd screwed up. I did stuff that felt fake and silly and awkward, like tallying how many times I said positive things and negative things, writing out my motivations and thoughts about past interactions, going through all the layers of why I did something or what I was thinking, making a point of methodically complimenting every member of my family for something, even though that felt ridiculous and fake. And it worked. It worked better over time as I noticed, as I developed the skills of noticing negativity, and I developed the mental muscles of communicating more compassionately. I saw the positive results on my relationships. I'm not sure how long it took, but every little bit that I did helped. The fact that I was doing anything helped. They could see I was working on it. And it changed how I interacted and how I thought. After a while, my oldest son told me he couldn't remember the last time I'd made a hurtful comment. And Mickey told me she could relax around me and not feel like I was going to say something mean. And I had made a transition from passive aggressive to assertive gentle. You can too, but maybe you have a completely different challenge. Maybe you have something totally different you need to work on. I'm just here to tell you, you can do it. You can make that change. You don't have to be stuck with an identity that doesn't work for you. Considering making a big change can feel like standing on a cliff and having somebody tell you, oh, just step off. But you're not the cliff. You're not the kind of person who stands on this cliff. You're not a person who falls if they don't stand on this cliff. You are the person stepping, and you are the person saying you need to step, and you are the stepping, and you are the place to step next. You standing on this spot is one moment. There will be new moments. There will be new ground to step on. And as you come to believe in yourself as a person who can make any changes you want to, you'll find you can make any changes with no loss of self, because you are the person who changes, not where you are now. The more you make changes of your own choice, the more you come to be yourself in the ways you most want to be. A loving person who's held back by fear or shame can learn to act more loving and have a life more full of love. An artist who thinks they're not good enough can do art anyway and become a better artist, or love doing the art for its own sake, or both. The changes you choose for the good of yourself and the world will not kill you. They will only make you even more yourself. You can change your mind and not die.
Thank you, Eva. Can everyone unmute and give her a round of applause?